During Thanksgiving dinner, I simply stopped my granddaughter from touching a sharp knife. Yet my daughter-in-law immediately slapped me hard across the face 3 times and snarled, "You're absolute trash, get out of here right now." Then she snatched up my handbag, hurled it at me and shouted, "Take your trash and get out of this house immediately." My son just stood there, arms crossed, saying nothing. I quietly gathered my things and left. 2 hours later, he called me, his voice trembling. "Mom, my wife just found it." "You chose to stay, and that means everything to me. Tell me in the comments, where in the world are you right now? What city? What country? Let Silent Revenge with Phoenix know who's in the room." One small note before we begin: some elements of this story are fictional, built for entertainment and education. The names and settings are coincidental, the lesson is not. The jazz was too cheerful for what that room was about to become. I noticed it the moment I walked through the front door. Chet Baker drifting out of the living room. Speakers soft and unhurried, the kind of music people put on when they want a gathering to feel effortless. The foyer smelled like roasted turkey and pine candles, and someone had arranged a small centerpiece of dried orange slices and cinnamon sticks on the entryway table. It looked like a magazine. It felt like a stage set. There were 12 of us that Thanksgiving evening, crowded around the long dining table in the house my son Mark called his. I say called his because the truth of that arrangement was something most people in the room didn't know yet, including Sarah, who had spent the last 4 years redecorating every room as though the deed had her name on it. She'd had the kitchen redone in white quartz and brushed gold. She'd replaced the original hardwood floors in the hallway with large format porcelain tile that clicked under heels. She'd hung a statement mirror in the dining room that cost more than my first car. I had said nothing about any of it. I'd learned early in my relationship with Sarah that offering an opinion, even a gentle one, carried consequences I wasn't always prepared to manage at 63 years old. The turkey sat between 2 dishes of mashed potatoes that nobody had touched for the better part of 10 minutes. My granddaughter Chloe, 4 years old and utterly unbothered by the tension that the adults were pretending didn't exist, was wriggling in her chair the way small children do when they've been asked to sit still for longer than is reasonable. Her dark eyes landed on the sterling silver bread knife resting near the edge of the table, ornate handle blade long enough to be genuinely dangerous in small hands. She leaned forward, her little fingers stretching toward it with the focused curiosity that only a 4-year-old can muster for an object she absolutely should not touch. I reached over quietly and curved my hand around her wrist. Not hard, just enough. "Sweetheart," I said, keeping my voice low the way you speak to a child you don't want to startle. "That knife is for the grown-ups. Let's leave it right where it is, okay?" Chloe pulled her hand back without complaint, already distracted by something across the table. It was over in 4 seconds. A grandmother redirecting a toddler away from a sharp object. The most unremarkable moment imaginable. Sarah put her fork down. The sound of it against the china plate was small, but in the particular silence that followed, it landed like a gavel. "Do you always have to do that?" Her voice had an edge. I recognized not quite anger yet, but the thing that comes just before it. The pressurized stillness of someone who has been waiting for a reason. Her eyes were fixed on me from across the table. "You always think you have the right to step in, don't you? Like nothing in this house runs without your input." I looked at her steadily. I was keeping her away from the knife, Sarah. She was about to grab the blade. I had it handled. She pushed her chair back an inch. Around the table, 12 people found something fascinating to stare at their plates. Their wine glasses, the centerpiece, anything that wasn't the 2 of us. My son Mark sat 3 chairs away. I glanced at him. He was cutting his turkey with great concentration, as though the precise angle of his knife was the most important thing happening in the room. "You always think you have everything under control." Sarah continued, her voice rising now, the pretense of dinner conversation falling away entirely. "Every single time you're here, it's the same thing. A comment here, a correction there, and we're all just supposed to smile and act like you're not doing it." "Sarah," I kept my voice even. Chloe was reaching for a knife. What happened next took less than 5 seconds. Sarah stood up from her chair. She came around the corner of the table in 3 steps, and before I understood what was happening, her palm connected with my face sharp, fast, the sound of it cracking through the room like something breaking. I turned, with the impact my hand flying up instinctively. I registered the stunned inhale from somewhere to my left, a child's uncertain whimper, the scrape of a chair. Then the second one came. Then the third. Not slaps the way people imagine them in movies. Theatrical, cinematic, one broad gesture that means something. These were fast and ugly and small, 3 quick strikes from a woman who had made a decision and was carrying it through before anyone at the table could process what they were seeing. Someone said her name. I don't know who. Sarah leaned down close to my face. I could smell the wine on her breath. Her voice dropped to something low and tight and deliberate, the kind of voice people use when they want to make sure every word lands exactly where they intend it. "You are exactly what I always knew you were." She straightened up, holding my gaze. "Trash. You hear me? You don't belong in this house, and you never did. You don't have the right to touch my daughter or correct my daughter or breathe in my direction." She grabbed the glass of red wine sitting at her place setting and upended it not toward the table, not accidentally directly onto the lap of my dress. The cold spread fast and dark across the fabric. Then she reached past me and snatched my handbag from the back of my chair. She held it for 1 second, looked me straight in the eye, and threw it. It hit me in the shoulder. Lipstick and keys and my reading glasses scattered across the floor. "Take your trash and get out of my house," she said. "Right now, tonight. I want you gone." The table was silent in the way that rooms go silent when something has happened that cannot be taken back. 12 adults, not one of them moving. My granddaughter Chloe had pressed herself back against her chair, her small face crumpled with an expression I recognized even on a 4-year-old, the particular fear of a child who has watched the adults in her world stop making sense. I looked at my son. Mark was still in his chair. His arms were crossed over his chest. His eyes met mine for one brief moment, and then he looked away. Not at Sarah, not at his daughter. Away. At the wall. At nothing. I bent down and picked up my handbag. My reading glasses had one lens cracked. I put them in the bag anyway. I found my lipstick near the chair leg and dropped it in without looking at it. I straightened up, reached back and adjusted the collar of my dress where it had twisted the small automatic gesture of a woman who has spent 63 years presenting herself with composure, whether she felt it or not. I walked through the dining room and into the foyer without speaking to anyone. I took my coat from the rack by the door. I put it on, buttoned it to the collar, and stepped outside into the November air, which was cold enough that I could see my breath. The street was quiet. The neighbors 3 doors down had a wreath of white lights on their front door. Someone nearby was playing their own Thanksgiving music, something with fiddles drifting faintly from a window. I stood at the end of the driveway and called a cab from my phone. While I waited, I became aware that my left cheek was throbbing. I pressed my fingertips against it once gently and then put my hand back in my coat pocket. The cab came in 11 minutes. I didn't cry in it. I don't say that to sound strong. I say it because I wasn't sad yet. I was somewhere past sad, and before understanding in the particular blank space that follows something your body has absorbed before your mind has caught up to what it means. My apartment was 20 minutes away. I went to the kitchen, filled a Ziploc bag with ice from the freezer the way my mother had taught me for bruises when I was 8 years old, wrapped it in a dish towel and pressed it against my cheekbone. I sat at the kitchen table in my wine-stained dress and held it there. The refrigerator hummed. The upstairs neighbor's television sent a faint murmur through the ceiling. Outside, a car passed with its radio on something with a strong bass line that faded before I could identify it. My phone rang at 11:47. Mark. I looked at his name on the screen for 2 full rings. Then I answered, Mom. His voice was unsteady in a way I hadn't heard from him since he was 19 and had crashed my car into a neighbor's fence and called me from the side of the road. Mom, I need to tell you something. Sarah found it. I adjusted the ice pack against my cheek. Found what, Mark? I said. though somewhere beneath the question in the part of me that had been paying attention for 12 years, I already knew exactly what he meant. "Where did she find it, Mark?" That was the first thing I said. Not "are you okay?" Not "what does she know?" Not "why are you calling me at midnight after watching your wife put her hands on me 3 times and doing nothing?" Just that. Because the location mattered. The location would tell me how long Sarah had been looking. Mark exhaled a shaky, pressurized sound like a man who had been holding his breath for hours. "Her office. She was looking for the insurance folder and she found the lockbox instead. Mom, she broke it open. She used a kitchen knife or something. The lid was bent when I got upstairs." I pressed the ice pack harder against my cheekbone and said nothing. "She found the original purchase agreement," he continued, his voice dropping. "The one with your name on it. She saw the percentage breakdown. She saw the occupancy clause." He stopped. "Mom, she's been in the bedroom for 40 minutes and she won't come out and she won't talk to me and I don't know what she's going to do." I knew what the occupancy clause said because I had written it, or rather I had sat across from my attorney 18 years ago and told him exactly what I wanted it to say. The language was straightforward, the way legal language is straightforward when someone has been careful. In the event of any act of physical aggression or verbal abuse directed toward the primary title holder by any occupying party, occupancy rights shall be considered immediately void, and the primary title holder reserves the right to pursue legal remedy without notice. I had never told Mark it was there. I had never told anyone. "Mark," I said, "I want you to listen to me carefully. Are you listening?" "Yes." His voice cracked on the single syllable. "I need you to go downstairs. I need you to pour yourself a glass of water, not wine water, and I need you to sit at the kitchen table and wait for me to call you back. Can you do that?" "Mom, what are you going to—" "Water, kitchen table. I'll call you back in 20 minutes. I ended the call. For a moment I sat completely still, the dish towel cold and damp against my face. Then I stood up, walked to the second bedroom I used as a home office, and opened my laptop. I typed in the security system login, the one Sarah had set up herself 8 months ago when she had cameras installed throughout the house. She had given me the access code as an afterthought, the way people hand over information they don't think will ever be used against them. Sarah had given me the login herself, one of those careless gestures people make when they hand over access they're certain will never be used against them. The footage loaded in under a minute. The dining room camera was positioned in the upper right corner of the ceiling, angled to capture the full table. The timestamp read 7:14 p.m. I could see all 12 people. I could see Chloe reaching toward the bread knife. I could see my hand catching her wrist. I could see myself speaking, my expression calm, my posture unthreatening. I could see Sarah stand up. I watched the next 40 seconds without moving. When it was over, I right-clicked on the file, selected download, and while it was saving to my hard drive, I opened my cloud storage account and uploaded a copy directly. Then I forwarded it to a second account. Then I texted the link to my personal email with the subject line Thanksgiving. Keep. By the time Sarah realized that footage existed, it would already be in 4 places she couldn't reach. I sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. My cheek had stopped throbbing and started aching instead, a deeper, duller pain that told me the bruising was settling in for the long stay. 12 years. I thought about that number. 12 years of holiday dinners where I chose my words the way a person chooses their footing on ice. 12 years of watching Mark laugh at Sarah's jokes at my expense and telling myself he was just keeping the peace. 12 years of swallowing observations that rose in my throat and forcing them back down because I loved my son and I loved my granddaughter, and I genuinely believed that patience was a form of love. It wasn't. I understood that now with the particular clarity that comes to a person sitting alone in a kitchen at midnight with a bruised face and a cloud backup already running. Patience without limit is just permission. I picked up my phone and called Mark back. He answered before the first ring finished. "Okay," I said. "Here's what's going to happen." There is something almost funny about people who need to control everything. They install the locks. They set the codes. They build the systems. And then when everything falls apart, they fall apart inside the very structure they constructed. Sarah had installed the cameras herself. 8 months ago, she had called me on a Tuesday afternoon unprompted to let me know she was upgrading the home security system. She framed it as a safety measure, better coverage of the driveway monitoring for the housekeeper peace of mind when they traveled. She had used the word transparency twice in that conversation. I remember thinking it was an interesting word choice for a woman who had never once been transparent with me about anything. I had saved the code without a second thought at the time. I had saved it without comment. Mark. I said, my phone warm against my ear, the cloud upload still running on my laptop screen. I need you to tell me something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Not the version you've been telling yourself. The actual truth. He was quiet for a moment. Okay. How long have you known that Sarah was going to do something like this? The silence that followed was not the silence of a man who didn't understand the question. It was the silence of a man doing inventory, counting backward, deciding how much of the ledger to open. I didn't know he started. I'm not asking about tonight specifically. I'm asking how long you have known that your wife looked at me the way she did, that she spoke to me the way she did, that it was building towards something. Another pause. Then quietly, a long time. And you said nothing. Mom, I was trying to keep things from what, Mark, from blowing up. My voice stayed level, but I felt something tighten behind my sternum, a slow and specific pain that had nothing to do with my cheekbone. Because I need you to understand something. Things did blow up. They blew up on me. Every time you stayed quiet, every time you laughed it off, or changed the subject, or told me not to take it personally, the pressure went somewhere. It didn't disappear. It just went somewhere else. Or else. Do you understand what I'm saying to you? He made a sound that might have been agreement and might have been the beginning of crying. With Mark, it was sometimes hard to tell the difference. There's more, he said. His voice had shifted lower, stripped of the performance quality it usually carried. Mom, the reason I never pushed back on Sarah, the reason I let her talk to you the way she did it, wasn't just because I was trying to keep the peace. He stopped. It was because she didn't know. About the house. About how much of it is yours. About where the money actually came from. If she'd known, if she'd figured out that I've been living off your financial backing for 12 years, she would have left. And I was afraid of that. I looked at the upload progress bar on my laptop. 64%. So you made me the target instead, I said. I didn't plan it that way. No, you just discovered it was convenient. I kept my voice even. Every time she got angry at me, that was energy she wasn't spending looking too closely at your finances. Every time I absorbed something from her, you got another month of not having to explain yourself. He didn't argue. That more than anything he could have said confirmed it. I found something on the camera footage. I said moving forward because there was nothing useful left in that particular truth. Tonight it would need to be returned to, but not now. Not at midnight when my face hurt and my granddaughter was asleep somewhere in that house, not knowing what had happened to her grandmother at the dinner table. Sarah is going to want to access the system and delete the recording from tonight. She won't be able to. It's already backed up. Mom, I also want you to know, I continued, that I am not angry with you right now. I want to be clear about that. What I am is finished. Finished with absorbing things so that other people don't have to feel the weight of what they've done. Finished pretending that your mother is someone who can be treated that way and will simply keep showing up the next holiday. I closed the laptop. The upload was complete. We are going to have a longer conversation about all of this, but tonight I want you to go be with your daughter. She was frightened at that table. Whatever else is happening in that house, she needs one of her parents to be present with her right now. A long beat of silence. Then, Mom, I'm sorry. I know you are, I said. Get some sleep, Mark. I ended the call, set my phone face down on the desk, and sat in the dark for a moment, with my hand resting flat on the closed laptop. Somewhere on that hard drive was 38 seconds of footage that showed exactly what kind of woman my son had chosen to protect for 12 years instead of me. I already knew what I was going to do with it. I did not sleep. I want to be honest about that, not because it makes me sound resilient, but because by 5 in the morning I had been awake for nearly 22 hours, and my body was letting me know about it in specific and unpleasant ways. My left eye had developed a faint twitch above the lid. My shoulders had locked into a position somewhere between a shrug and a flinch. The ice pack had long since melted into a bag of lukewarm water that I'd set in the kitchen sink around 2 a.m., and the bruise on my cheekbone had settled into something greenish and tender that I could feel every time I moved my jaw. I made coffee at 4:30. I sat at my desk with the laptop open and the footage queued, and I watched it 3 more times, not out of distress, but because I needed to know exactly what was there before I made a single phone call. 38 seconds, every second clear. The angle was slightly overhead, which meant Sarah's face was visible for the entire duration. You could see her stand up. You could see the deliberate path she took around the corner of the table. You could see her arm move 3 times. At 5:15, I called my attorney. His name was Gerald, and I had known him for 22 years, which meant he answered the phone at 5:15 in the morning with nothing more than a dry, "This better be interesting, Eleanor." "I have a video," I said, "and I need an emergency protective order filed when the courthouse opens." A brief pause. I heard him sit up in bed. "Tell me." I told him. I kept it factual and sequential, the way he had trained me to communicate with him over 2 decades of occasional but significant legal matters. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, in the way that Gerald was quiet when he was thinking, rather than when he had nothing to say. "Send me the footage right now," he said, "and forward the occupancy clause from the original purchase agreement. I know you have it saved somewhere you can access at 5 in the morning. 3rd folder on the left," I said. "Of course it is." I heard him exhale. "Eleanor, under California law, the documentation. You have the video. The police report the photographed injury supports an immediate domestic violence restraining order with an emergency move-out order. I'll file the emergency petition the moment the clerk's office opens at 8. Given that footage, the judge won't hesitate." "I haven't filed a police report yet," I said. "Do it now. Non-emergency line. Give them the footage link. Document the injury, take photographs of your face before you put anything else on it." A pause. "Can you do that?" "Yes." "Good. I'll have the petition drafted by 7:30. The occupancy clause will support a request for immediate vacation of the premises. Sarah has no ownership interest in that property, which means the standard eviction timeline doesn't apply. She's not a tenant with lease protections. She's an occupying party whose right of occupancy has been voided by her own actions." His voice had taken on the particular briskness of a man who had shifted from half asleep to fully operational. "This moves fast, Eleanor. Are you prepared for fast?" "I've been prepared for fast since about midnight," I said. "I filed the police report at 6 a.m. by phone. The officer who took my statement was professional and unhurried, and when I provided the cloud link for the footage, she confirmed it would be flagged for the responding detective. I photographed my face in the bathroom mirror with my phone. The bruise had spread enough by morning that the photographs were unambiguous. I sent them to Gerald without looking at them again. At 7:45, Gerald called back. "Petition is filed. Judge Harrison has the emergency motion. Given the footage and the documented injury, I expect the EPO by 9 and the vacation order shortly after." He paused. "Sarah will have 24 hours to remove her personal belongings from the premises once the order is served." My coffee had gone cold. I drank it anyway. At 8:50, my phone rang. It was Mark. I let it go to voicemail. 3 minutes later, it rang again, then a 3rd time. Then a text message appeared on my screen. "Mom, please answer. Sarah is losing it. She's been screaming at me since 6. Please." I set the phone face down on the desk. At 9:17, Gerald sent a single text, "EPO granted. Serving now." I stood up from my desk for the first time in hours, walked to the kitchen window, and looked out at the street below. The morning was gray and cold, the kind of November day that never quite decides to be anything. A woman was walking a golden retriever on the sidewalk across the street. The dog stopped to investigate something near a fire hydrant with tremendous seriousness. 20 minutes later, someone knocked on my apartment door. Not Sarah. Not the police. I looked through the peephole and felt something tighten in my chest that was equal parts grief and recognition. Mark. Standing in my hallway, still wearing yesterday's shirt, his eyes red-rimmed and raw, his hands hanging at his sides like a man who had already run out of arguments before he knocked. I put my hand on the deadbolt. Then I opened the door. He looked smaller than I remembered him. That's the only way I can describe it. My son is 6 feet tall and has his father's shoulders, and standing in my hallway in yesterday's wrinkled shirt, with his eyes swollen and his jaw unshaved, he looked like a version of himself that had been left out in the rain overnight. I stepped back from the door without saying anything, and he came inside. He stood in the middle of my living room and looked around the apartment the way people look at a place when they're buying time before they have to speak. Then he looked at my face. His mouth opened and then closed. His eyes filled fast and sudden, the way eyes fill when a person has been holding something back for hours and the sight of the actual damage undoes them completely. "Mom," he said, and his voice broke apart on the single syllable. "Mom, your face." "Sit down, Mark." I should have. "Sit down." He sat. I went to the kitchen and poured 2 cups of coffee that neither of us particularly wanted, and set one in front of him and kept one in my hands because I needed something to hold on to. I sat across from him at the table where I had spent the night filing police reports and watching 38 seconds of footage on a loop, and I looked at my son and waited. "I don't know where to start," he said. "Start with the first time," I said. "The first time Sarah said something to me that you knew was wrong and you didn't correct her." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. His knuckles were white. "Chloe's first birthday," he said finally. "You brought the wrong cake. Sarah had told you chocolate and you brought vanilla because Chloe had grabbed a vanilla sample at the bakery the week before and you thought she'd prefer it." He stared at the table. "Sarah made a comment in the kitchen, called you controlling, said you always thought you knew better than everyone else." He paused. I laughed. I remembered the birthday. I did not remember laughing. "Why?" I asked. "Because it was easier." His voice cracked again, a fault line running through it. "Because if Sarah was focused on being angry at you, she wasn't asking me questions I didn't want to answer, about money, about the house, about why my salary never quite seemed to stretch the way it should." He pressed the heel of his hand against his eye socket hard, the way men do when they're trying to stop something they don't want anyone to see. "I told myself it wasn't hurting anything, that you were strong enough to handle it, that it would blow over. It never blew over," I said. "No." His voice was barely above a whisper. "It just got worse every year because I kept letting it." I set my coffee cup down. My hands were steadier than I expected them to be. "Do you know what I did every Thanksgiving on the drive over?" He shook his head. I reminded myself of 3 things I was grateful for about Sarah. I did it deliberately like an exercise because I knew that if I walked in the door already defensive, it would go badly. I did that for 11 years. I looked at him. "I was working so hard to be fair to her, Mark, and you were in that house watching it happen and using it." He flinched like I'd struck him. "Good." "I know," he said. "I know exactly what I did." "Then say it clearly, not to make me feel better, because you need to hear yourself say it." He raised his head. His eyes were red and wet and completely without defense. "I used you as a buffer. I let Sarah aim at you so she wouldn't aim at me. Every decision I made that she might have questioned the money, the house, the way I handled our finances, I let her believe it was your influence. Your control, your fault." His voice dropped to something raw and unsteady. "You already said as much to me," I told him, but I needed to hear him say it himself. "I made you the villain in my marriage so I didn't have to be." The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car horn sounded twice on the street below, sharp and brief, and then the morning went quiet again. I felt something move through my chest. Not anger, something older and heavier than anger. The specific grief of a parent who finally stops being surprised. I had loved this man since before he existed. I had sat in a hospital room for 19 hours waiting to meet him. I had driven him to baseball practice and held him through his father's funeral and lent him money I never asked to have returned because I believed in the person I thought he was becoming. I reached across the table and put my hand over his. He looked up, startled. "I'm not going to tell you it's okay," I said. "It isn't. But I'm also not going to pretend I don't know who taught you that silence was safer than honesty. Your father did the same thing to me for 30 years. I squeezed his hand once, then let go. "That pattern ends here. With you, in this kitchen. Do you understand me?" He nodded. His shoulders shook once, twice, and then he pressed his face into his hands and cried the way men cry when they finally run out of reasons not to, with his whole body, without grace, without any attempt to manage how it looked. I sat with him and did not look away. My phone buzzed on the desk, a text from an unknown number. I reached over and read it without standing up. "You think you've won something. You haven't. We need to talk, so." I turned the phone face down, looked at my son crying into his hands, and thought, she still doesn't understand what's already been set in motion. Before I show you exactly what Eleanor had waiting inside that notary's office, comment, "Phoenix below so I know you're still here." What happens in that room is the moment everything shifts. Sarah thought she was winning. She had no idea what was already signed, sealed, and sitting in a folder across the table. This story contains some fictional elements crafted for entertainment and educational purposes. If that's not for you, it's perfectly fine to step away right here. I called Mark on Tuesday morning with the tone I used to use when he was 16 and had done something that required a conversation neither of us wanted to have. Wednesday, 10 o'clock. Gerald's office building, 3rd floor. Bring your ID. A pause. "Mom, what is this about?" "It's about resolving things quietly," I said. "Isn't that what you wanted?" He came. I knew he would because Mark had spent his entire adult life believing that every problem had a version where nobody had to lose face, where the furniture got rearranged just enough that everything looked different without actually changing. He walked into the notary's office on Wednesday morning in a pressed shirt and a sport coat, which told me he had decided this meeting was something he could manage. He shook hands with the notary. He nodded at Gerald. He sat down across from me and folded his hands on the table like a man prepared to negotiate. Gerald opened the folder. "What your mother has asked me to prepare," Gerald said in the particular unhurried voice he used when he wanted someone to understand that the ground beneath them was not what they thought it was, "is a formal acknowledgement of existing personal loans, not new documents, a consolidation of what already exists." He slid the first page across. "The amount your mother advanced for your vehicle purchase in 2019, the business loan from 2021 that was never formalized, the operating funds transferred to your personal account in 2022 and 2023. He paused. "These are not new obligations, Mark. They are existing ones. This document simply puts them in writing." Mark looked at the page. Then he looked at me. "Mom." I also had Gerald prepare a separate acknowledgement. I continued, "that you were fully informed of the ownership structure of the property before your marriage, that you understood the occupancy conditions, and that you confirm in writing that you will not contest the terms of the original purchase agreement." I kept my voice even. "You already knew all of this was true. You're simply signing to say so. This is—" He stopped, picked up the document, put it down. "Sarah is going to—" "Sarah," I said carefully, "is not in this room." Gerald cleared his throat. "I want to be transparent, Mark. You have every right to take these documents to your own attorney before signing. I've arranged for an independent legal advisor to be available downstairs at no cost to you if you'd like 30 minutes to review. Nobody is rushing you." Mark stared at the papers for a long moment. I watched him do the math, the quiet, rapid calculation of a man weighing what he stood to lose against what he might still salvage. Gerald had structured everything so that refusing to sign meant contesting debts that were already real. It meant challenging an ownership arrangement he had known about for years. It meant going to court with a wife who was currently under an emergency protective order, and footage of her assaulting his mother. He picked up the pen. He signed each page slowly without speaking the way people sign things when they understand that the window for a different outcome has already closed. When he finished, he set the pen down and pushed the folder back across the table. What Mark didn't know, what I had chosen not to tell him when he sat at my kitchen table 2 days earlier, was that I had made 3 calls after he left. 1 to Gerald, 1 to a private investigator, 1 to a forensic accountant whose name I had been given years ago by a colleague and had never needed until now. Until now. Is there anything else? His voice was flat and hollow. One more thing. Gerald produced a single additional page. This is the documentation your mother received yesterday from her forensic accountant. It details a pattern of unauthorized transfers from the family holding company to an external account registered to Sarah's brother. He let that sit for a moment. Your mother has not yet decided whether to forward this to the district attorney's office. That decision remains hers. Mark went very still. I picked up my bag and buttoned my coat. "I'll see myself out," I said. In the elevator going down, I pressed the button for the lobby and stared at my reflection in the brushed steel doors. The bruise on my cheek had faded to yellow at the edges. In another week, it would be gone entirely. Some things healed faster than others. My phone rang as I stepped onto the sidewalk. Mark already. I let it ring. Then came a text, "You set me up." I typed back 3 words and put the phone in my bag. "No. You did." The truth has a way of finding its own transportation. I did not go looking for Ryan. Sarah's older brother had been seated 4 chairs down from me at the Thanksgiving table, close enough that I had watched him flinch at the first sound, watched him reach for his water glass, and then stop. Watched him make the same calculation every adult at that table made. In those 5 seconds, do I move or do I wait to see if this is actually happening? He had waited. They all had. But Ryan had been carrying the weight of that decision differently than the others, because 3 days after Thanksgiving, he called Gerald's office and asked to speak with whoever was representing Eleanor Hartwell. Gerald called me that same afternoon. "Sarah's brother wants to talk," he said. "He says he has information and he wants to give it voluntarily. No subpoena, no negotiation. He just wants to talk." "Then let him talk," I said. Ryan came to Gerald's office on a Thursday morning. He was a quiet man in his mid-40s, the kind of person who chose his words, the way someone chooses footing on uncertain ground, carefully, 1 step at a time. He sat across from Gerald and me and folded his hands on the table and said, without preamble, "My parents are 71 and 68 years old. Sarah took $43,000 from their retirement account over the past 2 years. She told them it was a loan she was managing on their behalf. She never made a single payment back." He looked at me directly. "I should have said something sooner. I'm saying it now." He was not the only one. 2 other family members who had been present at Thanksgiving contacted Gerald within the following week, a cousin and an aunt, both of whom had watched Sarah's behavior toward me escalate over years of gatherings, and had said nothing, because as the aunt put it, Sarah has a way of making you feel like the problem is your reaction, not her behavior. They were prepared to testify. They signed statements. They answered every question Gerald put to them without hesitation. Meanwhile, the private investigator Gerald had recommended filed his report on a Wednesday afternoon. The investigator pulled records I hadn't known to ask for. Sarah's previous marriage in Arizona had ended with a civil protective order. The records were sealed under a settlement agreement, but the investigator had located the former husband who was willing to speak. He described a pattern so familiar it made my stomach tighten. The escalation, the isolation, the financial control, the precise moment when the performance of reasonableness dropped entirely. I read the report sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea that went cold before I reached the last page. I did not feel vindicated. I want to be clear about that. What I felt was something closer to a hollowness I hadn't expected, the particular weariness of a person who has just been handed confirmation of something they already knew, but had spent years hoping they were wrong about. I thought about Chloe, 4 years old in temporary care while the legal proceedings moved forward, probably asking questions that nobody around her knew how to answer honestly. That was the part that sat heaviest. Gerald called at 4:30. "The asset freeze motion was granted this afternoon," he said. "The judge reviewed the forensic accountant's report and the documentation from the holding company. All joint accounts are frozen pending the fraud investigation. Sarah's attorney withdrew from the case this morning. She can no longer cover his retainer." I set my tea down. "How is Chloe?" A brief pause. Gerald was not accustomed to that being the first follow-up question. "The Guardian ad litem report is due Friday," he said. "From what I understand, she's settled, asking for you." I closed my eyes for a moment. "Gerald," I said, "what do I need to do to bring her home?" I had been expecting her for 3 days, not because I wanted her to come, because I understood by that point exactly how Sarah operated when she ran out of options. She did not retreat. She did not recalibrate. She moved forward, louder, faster, with less calculation than before, because forward was the only direction she knew when the walls started closing in. I had watched her do it at the Thanksgiving table. I had watched her do it in the text messages that kept arriving on my phone at irregular hours, each one slightly more pressurized than the last. The account freeze had been the final wall. After that, I knew it was only a matter of time. I called the non-emergency line on Wednesday afternoon and told them I had an active emergency protective order and reason to believe the subject might attempt to make contact. The officer I spoke with was efficient and unhurried. He confirmed that 2 patrol units would be in the area that evening and that I should call 911 the moment Sarah appeared. He did not tell me everything would be fine. I appreciated that. False reassurance from law enforcement is its own particular kind of condescension. I ate dinner alone at 7 o'clock. Soup from a can, which I heated on the stove, and ate standing at the kitchen counter, because I was too tired to sit at the table and pretend it was a meal. My body had been running on 4 and 5 hours of sleep for nearly 3 weeks. My shoulders hurt. My jaw still ached faintly on the left side when I chewed. I washed the bowl, dried it, put it back in the cabinet, and went to sit in the armchair near the window with a book I did not read. I had raised a son in this city. I had buried a husband here. I had built a business from a single office with secondhand furniture and a coffee maker that took 12 minutes to produce anything drinkable, and I had turned it into something that outlasted the marriage and the grief, and 23 years of other people telling me I was too cautious, too deliberate, too slow to trust. I had never once confused patience with weakness, but somewhere along the way I had confused love with endurance, and those are not the same thing, and the difference had cost me more than I wanted to calculate, sitting alone in an armchair at 8:30 on a Wednesday night. My phone buzzed on the side table. A text from a number I didn't recognize, a friend of Sarah's. I would later discover someone she had recruited to deliver a final message before she ran out of people willing to carry her water. She just wants to talk. She's not going to do anything. Just open the door. I set the phone face down and picked up my book again. She arrived at 9:42. I heard her in the hallway before she reached my door, her heels on the tile floor, fast and uneven, the sound of someone who had stopped caring about composure. She knocked once hard enough that I felt it in my chest, and then she didn't stop. "Eleanor." Her voice was raw and tight and completely stripped of the careful social performance she usually maintained. "Eleanor, I know you're in there. Open the door. We need to talk right now. You have no idea what you've done. You have no idea what you've taken from me. Open this door." I did not move from the armchair. "Everything I built," she said louder now, her fist hitting the door in a rhythm that had lost any pretense of a knock and become something else entirely. "Everything I worked for. You think you can take my husband and my house and my daughter, and there are no consequences for that. Open the door, Eleanor. Open it right now, or I swear to God I will." the hallway went abruptly quiet. Not because Sarah had stopped, because two police officers had reached the end of the corridor. I heard one of them speak calm, clear, the particular tone of someone trained to de-escalate without negotiating. I heard Sarah's voice rise in response, sharp and disbelieving, the voice of a woman who had spent her entire life operating on the assumption that scenes like this one resolved themselves in her favor. Then her voice cracked. Then it broke into something that was half argument and half something rawer and more frightened than argument, the sound of a person finally understanding that the story they had been telling themselves for years had run out of road. I heard the specific sound of handcuffs, a small, definitive click that carried through the door with perfect clarity. Then footsteps receding down the corridor, the elevator doors opening and closing, and then the particular silence that follows the end of a very long and very loud thing, the kind of silence that has texture and weight and feels in the first few seconds almost impossible to believe. I sat in the armchair for a long time without moving. The book was still open on my lap to a page I hadn't read. Outside, a siren started up briefly in the street below, then faded north, then was gone. I thought about the first time Sarah had come to a family dinner. She had brought flowers, hydrangeas, pale blue, the expensive kind, from a proper florist, rather than a grocery store. And she had laughed at all the right moments and asked me questions about my work with what appeared to be genuine interest. I had driven home that night and told my friend Carol that Mark had finally found someone worth keeping. I had believed it completely. I had been wrong about a great many things in my 63 years. That one still surprised me. I was not glad about what had just happened in the hallway. I want to be honest about that. What I felt sitting in that chair in the quiet of my apartment was something I didn't have a clean word for. Not relief exactly. Not satisfaction, something more like the specific exhaustion that follows a very long storm. The kind of tired that only arrives once you finally believe it's actually over. My phone rang. Mark. I looked at his name on the screen for 2 full rings. My son, who had chosen wrong for 12 years and was now living in a 1-bedroom rental with a second-hand couch, learning what it felt like to stand on ground. He had built himself rather than borrowed from someone who loved him more than he had earned. I thought about the boy who used to fall asleep in the back seat of my car on the drive home from his grandmother's house, his face slack and trusting in the way that children's faces are when they have no reason yet to be anything else. I answered. "She's been arrested," I said before he could speak. "Chloe is safe. That's all that matters tonight." I loved my son before I knew his face. That is not a figure of speech. I loved him in the specific physical, irrational way that parents love children who have not yet arrived before the first cry, before the first breath, before I had any evidence of who he was going to be. That love did not go away when he disappointed me. It did not go away when he told me sitting at my kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a coffee cup that he had spent 12 years using me as a shield. Love like that doesn't work on an on and off switch. It just changes shape. It becomes something harder and more honest and considerably less comfortable for everyone involved. He arrived at 8:15 in the morning with Chloe asleep against his shoulder, her cheek pressed to the collar of his jacket, her small hand curled loosely near her own chin. He looked like he hadn't slept. I stepped back from the door, and he carried her inside and laid her carefully on the couch, then covered her with the fleece blanket I kept folded over the armrest. He stood there for a moment, looking down at her with an expression I recognized, the particular helplessness of a parent watching a child sleep and understanding that sleep is the only time you can be certain they're all right. Then he turned around and sat down at the kitchen table, and I sat across from him, and for a moment neither of us spoke, because some things need a breath of space before they can be said correctly. "I want to ask you to fix this," he said finally. His voice was quiet and without performance. "I want to ask you to help me the way you always have, to make some calls and find some angle and pull us back from whatever edge we're standing on." He looked at his hands. "I know I don't have the right to ask that." "No?" I said. "You don't?" He nodded. He had known the answer before he said it. "What I can tell you," I continued, is that I've spoken to Gerald about temporary guardianship for Chloe. While the court determines what the appropriate long-term arrangement looks like given Sarah's arrest and the ongoing fraud investigation, a grandparent can petition for temporary custody when both parents are deemed unable to provide stable care. You're not being charged with anything, but you're also not stable right now, Mark. You know that. I know that, he said. I'll petition for temporary guardianship. Chloe will stay with me while things are sorted out. That is not a punishment. That is me making sure that little girl has one person in her life right now who is not in the middle of falling apart. I kept my voice level, but I felt something press against the inside of my chest. When I said it, the specific ache of doing the right thing, when the right thing costs something real. You and I are going to have a long road ahead of us. I won't pretend otherwise. He looked up at me. His eyes were dry, but barely. Do you think we get there to the other side of it? I thought about that, honestly, the way he deserved. I think you're finally asking the right questions, I said. That's not nothing. From the couch, Chloe stirred. She pushed herself upright, looked around the apartment with the slow, blinking confusion of a child waking somewhere unfamiliar, and then her eyes found me, Grandma. She held both arms out the way children do when they have decided something is certain. I went to her. The escrow closed on a Tuesday in late April, which meant that the house, the white quartz kitchen, the porcelain tile hallway, the statement mirror that had cost more than my first car belonged to someone else by 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I signed the final paperwork at the title company and walked out into a parking lot full of spring sunshine and felt with considerable surprise almost nothing. Not grief, not relief, just the particular lightness of a person who has set down something heavy they had been carrying for so long they had stopped noticing the weight. I had already found the new place by then. A small house in a coastal town 3 hours north, 2 bedrooms, a porch that faced the water, a yard with a fig tree that Chloe had immediately claimed as her own personal territory the first afternoon we visited. The kitchen needed work. The bathroom tiles were 20 years out of date. I made an offer the same day. Sarah's case had resolved 6 weeks earlier. She had accepted a plea agreement, probation, mandatory counseling, a permanent restraining order. She was not in prison. I had not asked for prison. What I had asked for, through Gerald, was documentation, a record, something that could not be sealed or settled away with a check. The court had provided that. Mark was living 40 minutes away in a 2-bedroom apartment. He had taken a position with a smaller firm one that had nothing to do with family money or family connections. We spoke on the phone on Sunday evenings. The conversations were short and careful, the way conversations are when two people are rebuilding something that was damaged over a long time and understand that the rebuilding cannot be rushed. He was doing the work. I could hear it in the way he talked, less performance, more honesty, more of the son I had believed he could be. Chloe started kindergarten in September. On her first day, she wore a backpack covered in printed sea turtles and informed me at breakfast that she already knew how to read and therefore school was probably unnecessary. I told her to eat her toast. She ate her toast. We walked to school together in the early morning light, her hand in mine, the sound of the ocean 2 blocks away, carrying faintly through the salt air. That evening, I sat on the porch and watched the sun go down over the water. The fig tree threw a long shadow across the yard. Somewhere inside, Chloe was talking to herself the way children do when they are playing alone and entirely content. I had one key on my key ring. Mine. For years, I had believed that loving people meant making yourself available to whatever they needed from you without condition, without limit. I had called that generosity. Mostly it had been fear of being too much, taking up too much space, wanting too much in return. I was 63 years old, sitting on a porch by the sea, and I was done being afraid. If there is one thing I want you to take from my story, it is this: kindness without boundaries is not a virtue. It is an open door to people who will walk through it and take everything that isn't nailed down. I spent 12 years calling my silence patience. I called my endurance love. I told myself I was keeping the peace. I wasn't. I was just making myself smaller so that other people could feel larger. Don't do what I did. Don't wait until someone puts their hands on you before you decide that your dignity is worth protecting. Don't let the family table become the place where you disappear. God sees what is done in the dark, and eventually the light finds its way in. These are the revenge stories with Mom that nobody warns you about, the quiet, accumulated kind that builds over 12 years of holiday dinners and unanswered phone calls. The revenge stories with Mom that end not with shouting, but with a signed document, a coastal town, and one key on a key ring. The revenge stories with Mom that teach you finally that protecting yourself is not cruelty, it is survival. I have lived one of these family revenge stories from the inside. I know what it costs. These family revenge stories do not end in bitterness. They end in clarity, in a porch, by the sea, in a 4-year-old who says, "Grandma," like it is the most certain thing in the world. If these family revenge stories found you today, that is not an accident. I am not a perfect mother, but I am, for the first time in a very long time, free. And that is enough. If this story lived inside, you leave a comment, share this with someone who needs it, and subscribe, because the next story is already waiting. Thank you for staying until the very end. Here at Silent Revenge with Phoenix, the stories ahead contain fictional elements built for educational purposes. If that is not for you, step away and take good care of yourself.